Hey, Shep here at Iron Anchor Cycles, and today I want to talk about why and how to upgrade the suspension on your Harley-Davidson motorcycle. I think that a lot of people might miss this particular step when going through all the upgrades they want to do on their bike, and so what I want to do is clear up a few things about the first piece, why you should upgrade your suspension, and then the second piece, what's the way to do that, or ways to do that, I should say. So starting with the beginning, Harley-Davidson suspensions are, well, not great. I don't think that's a discredit to the way that they're manufactured or what Harley is producing, but essentially what they're doing is creating an economical suspension that they can include on the bike without increasing the price beyond where it already is, and creating a suspension that's going to be fine for, let's call it, 80% of riders. This is a thing I talk about a lot when it comes to Harley, and it's the 80-20 rule, where Harley's a big company and manufactures a lot of bikes and produces those bikes for the 80%. For the 20% of people out there who want to upgrade, whether it's they need better suspension or more power or better brakes or a different kind of seat, whatever that is, everybody's going to do something, but most people aren't going to do everything. And so the notion is that when you're mass producing a product, you're going to build that for the 80%. And then for those people who want to upgrade, you have that opportunity to do so. So it's a little bit of just a personal thought on how Harley makes things, but nevertheless, when we talk about Harley-Davidson suspension, if you really want to go out and ride your bike and push it into corners and ride it a little more aggressively than, let's say, the average rider, you're going to need to upgrade the suspension. There's really no question about that. And there's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that, and we'll talk about that when it comes to the shocks as well. So the first thing about upgrading suspension, I think, is what comes to most people's minds is ride quality. Essentially getting a better shock with more tech in it, with better controls, and we'll talk a little about how the shocks work, you're going to get a better ride. And that better ride may mean a lot of things to you. It might mean it's more comfortable if you're talking about a touring bike and you're doing long rides. It may mean that it has better rebound control if you're talking about wanting to carve canyons and ride a little more aggressively. Better can mean a lot of things, and in most upgraded shocks, you're going to be better kind of across the board. Another reason why you may want to upgrade a shock, we're still in that why section of this video, is adjustability. Your Harley-Davidson stock shock in a lot of cases has almost no, if not none at all, no ability to be adjusted. And kind of look at the shocks that we've got sitting here. So we'll start with this one. This is a shock off of a Sportster. It's an OE Harley shock. And you can see here that down here at the bottom, hopefully you can see that, there is the ability to turn this collar and adjust this preload on this shock. You've got 1, 2, 3 settings on this Sportster shock. And on this Dyna Shock, while you can't see it, that preload adjuster is in here in the bottom. And you're basically grabbing this whole collar with a spanner and turning it. And you've got, it looks like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points of adjustment for a shock preload on here. So on a stock Harley shock, that's it, right? If you've got a bagger, I don't have an old bagger air shock here, but essentially those old ones were you put, depending on the pressure of air you put in there with the little hand pump tool, you would essentially adjust the equivalent of shock preload on these coil shocks. So that's it. If you're wanting to have more adjustment in terms of preload, where maybe you need more or less than what this allows, or even being able to go in between those clicks, that's something that's missing from these shocks. They're not height adjustable in most cases. They don't have rebound control adjustment in most cases. So again, it's sort of what you've got is what you've got, and you may want more adjustment out of your shock. So talked about ride quality, talked about adjustability. The last piece, and hopefully this one isn't one that's too often overlooked, is height, which is a big deal. In most cases, when we talk about bikes that we're doing, we're talking about height in terms of going up. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The higher you get your bike off the ground, the more lean angle is available to you when you're riding it to be able to lean the bike further over without scraping pegs, primary, exhaust, all those good stuff that you drag along when you're riding. There is another side to that coin, which is for a shorter rider, you may want to adjust your suspension lower so that you can get your feet on the ground on a bigger bike. Again, those are valid reasons for why you would want to change or upgrade your Harley-Davidson suspension. So that's essentially the why. And we're talking mostly here today about rear suspension, but the same is pretty true of the front. It's just a little harder to look at because the internals live inside the fork tubes. But needless to say, everything we're talking about here today, you kind of start with the rear because it's the easiest to do, and you can match everything you do on the front. You can put longer fork tubes on, put spacers in, you can change your springs, and you can get upgraded internals in terms of cartridges as well. So that'll be for another video. Today we're primarily talking about the rear, but suffice it to say, the same holds true for the front. So that was why. Now we're going to talk about how. So right here on the table in front of me, I've got two original Harley shocks, a Sportster Shock, a Dyna Shock, and then I've got an upgraded shock here. Now, again, this video is not going to be a product-specific kind of thing. This happens to be a Legend Revo A Dyna Shock that's sitting here. But I don't want to necessarily talk about the Legend or Revo A specifically. We'll go over and look at some Öhlins shocks that we've got on a bike here and kind of make some comparisons as well. Basically what we're talking about is a premium upgraded shock versus stock and what that affords you. So like I said, I'm going to go back to one of these stockers for a moment and talk about what's here so we can sort of talk about the differences. So kind of trying to go apples to apples, we'll look at the Dyna Shock compared to this Revo A for a Dyna. So first off, when you pick this thing up, and you can't do it because it's here and you're on the other side of the camera, but believe me when I say this is heavy. This is a steel construction, not a lot of, you know, I wouldn't say design that goes into materials, etc. on here. So it's a heavy shock. Looking up at the top, you've got for the eyelets, you have rubber bushings here, and that's essentially isolating the shock itself from the frame of the motorcycle when you have it attached. And then, like I said, down at the bottom, hard to see because of this collar that they put on here, but you do have adjustability in terms of preload, a couple of clicks, and you use a spanner wrench to do that. So, and this shock is 12.5 inches. That's a stock shock off of Dyna, I believe, off a Super Glide. Looking at the Sportster Shock, it's essentially the same, right? It's a little longer because of the Sportster application that it came off of, came with a longer shock, and a little less adjustability in terms of preload like we looked at, only 3 different spots, but you've got the same rubber bushings in these eyelets here. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with a stock shock. Looking at the upgraded shock, the first thing, and this is, I can't stress enough, how much lighter this is when you pick it up. It's really incredible. And the reason for that is when you look at what this shock is constructed out of, it's a CNC billet aluminum body to this shock, which is way lighter than steel. And when you're talking about a heavy Harley-Davidson motorcycle, any opportunity to shed some unneeded weight is a good opportunity. So that's number one. Number two is going to be the preload adjustment on this. Remember we talked about having those sort of click settings that would adjust the preload? Well, on this shock, and it's going to be the same for most upgraded shocks, Öhlins and others, where the preload isn't necessarily, or I should say, isn't a situation where you're clicking it to different settings. You actually have threads running up the shock body, and you can turn this collar that's here to up and down the shock wherever you need it to be to set that preload and make it correct for what you need. So you have a much bigger range of the preload you can adjust, and it's also more finely adjustable as well because it's a threaded collar as opposed to those clicking spots. The next thing is going to be kind of sticking with some of the comparisons. Rather than these rubber bushings that are in the stock shocks, which eventually will wear out like any rubber bushing will, you've got a really, really nice spherical bearing that lives inside the top and bottom of these shocks. And so this is going to hold that shock really firmly, give it the ability to rotate a little bit that it needs to work, but it's going to eliminate any lateral motion that you don't want in that shock. So a vastly superior joint here at the top and bottom of the shock versus the OE. Lastly, on this shock, talking about adjustability, you've got a wheel here, or a screw, I guess, that clicks, And you've got 1 through 6. And these numbers are going to determine your rebound adjustment. And this is just a whole piece of adjustment that isn't available in that stock shock. So from the softest setting at 1 to the stiffest setting at 6, this is going to determine how fast the shock returns to its extended length after compressing from a bump in the road. And essentially what you're going to find there is it would be the equivalent of saying you're going to have a more plush ride with that lower numbered setting and a stiffer ride. It's not really what those things are. Those words are more describing how it's going to feel. And so essentially, if you're doing a big ride, on the highway, just kind of cruising along, probably turning that wheel down is going to be a little bit better for you. But if you're out riding aggressively, doing the canyons, following the twisties, all that great stuff, just going to click this thing up, and the bike is going to respond a lot faster, and will again feel like the suspension is being stiffened up. So that's essentially what you've got with adjustability with this shock. And so we've talked about, it is a superior shock in terms of how it's built. We talked about the aluminum versus the steel. It's got way more adjustment. The last piece obviously is length. So these come in 3 different lengths that you can choose from for a Dyna. Look at all the manufacturers that are out there and look at all the different applications. The sky's the limit, essentially. This happens to be a 14-inch shock, so it's going to raise this Dyna that originally had a 12.5-inch shock. It's going to raise that rear by 1.5 inches. Again, you can pick the height that works for you, whether that's taller or shorter. So the last thing to talk about, and it just kind of has to do with overall quality, is the internals and how well these shocks work, as well as the spring itself, which is really important. So one of the things that I think is perhaps missing when people think about this is it's not just about the adjustability, the way the shock looks, and the height. You're really going to get better performance out of a better spring and better internals. And when I say internals, it's how that oil is gated and moving through the internal piston here. And then in terms of this spring itself, how it works and how well it performs under real life conditions. So you've got a much greater range in let's call it the sweet spot of this shock because of this spring than on the Harley shock. So, you can kind of even see you've got a much more tightly wound coil here than you have here, which essentially, without getting too much into the physics of it, it means that this shock has more travel to it and more of a sweet spot in that travel range. So really, all in all, it's a huge advantage for you to go with an upgraded shock. Legend is a great example of it. Öhlins is something we carry as well. RWD is great also. Like I said, I don't want to be product specific here, but more just about what to be looking for in a shock and why it'll help you. So that's what we've got here. I do want to talk about one other thing that has become more and more common recently. So we're going to pause the video here and reset, and we're going to talk about one more shock. Okay, so we are over looking at another type of upgraded shock, and obviously this one comes from Öhlins, and pretty clear that it looks a little different than the Legend shock that we were looking at. Again, not to be brand or product specific here, we're talking more about the style of shock as opposed to the manufacturer or the specific product. A remote reservoir shock, which is what we're looking at here, is available from Legend and also from other premium manufacturers. And this would be your top of the line shock. What you get from this is, as well as some additional upgraded internals and all the benefits that we had on the shock we were just looking at, you now have the remote reservoir, as well as one additional level of adjustment. In addition to the preload adjustment, which is the same on this shock, you can see the collar that threads onto the shock body itself, and you'll spin this up or down to adjust preload. You also have the rebound adjustment down here at the bottom, and this wheel spins and clicks. You also now have a compression adjustment that's here on the reservoir. And a quick point to make as well, this obviously we're looking at is a Dyna Shock here again. these remote reservoir shocks are available for any Harley-Davidson application. For a touring model, rather than being hard mounted to the shock body itself, the reservoir is going to be truly remote and have a line that connects the reservoir to the shock, so that when the shocks are mounted underneath the saddlebags, they'll fit, and the reservoirs are going to be placed above or below the bags so that you'll have access to them and you'll have access to that compression adjustment. So there you have it. That's going to be the beginning and end of why and how to upgrade your Harley-Davidson suspension. Obviously, like I said, we talked mostly or primarily about rear suspension today. But like I mentioned, the front suspension, all the same logic and characteristics apply. The same types of things we were discussing here are going to apply to your front suspension as well. Down the road, we'll do another video and we'll talk about some of the different types of things there are to upgrade your suspension. Anything from as simple as extending the length, getting a little more travel, upgraded springs, cartridge shocks, all the way up to inverted front ends. Lots of different opportunities and ways to do that. But the same logic applies in terms of the how and the why. So that's going to be it. If you have any questions about your suspension or any of the products we talked about, feel free to reach out. You can check out any of these products we mentioned as well on our website at ironanchorcycles.com. Thanks very much.